Welcome to Sex Talks with Diana, a space where, from sex work to tantra, we tap into raw experiences to uncover how they intersect with sex and sexuality. Because knowledge not only lives in books, we listen to people and their stories. Let's dive in. Today we're talking with Piers Delahunt, who's been a longtime friend of my Sex Bio, as well as a my Sex Bio studio facilitator for fucking Capitalism class, where we discuss how political economy intersects with sexuality. Piers, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So I'll let you introduce yourself to the audience if you don't mind.
Sure. My name is Piers Delahunt. I am a gig teacher, by which I mean that I visit schools or venues for the day or to do a workshop, rather than a Monday through Friday 7 to 3 classroom teacher like that. And I teach what I call socialist emotional learning, by which I mean that I integrate on the one side, the interpersonal social emotional learning stuff, and on the other side, the institutional socialist politics stuff. I think that we need to be teaching them together, that leaving one out from the other conversation actually hinders both. I can say more on that, but that's the basic idea. I'm very passionate about creating both of those best practices and supporting both of those so that we can be in good relationship with each other and with ourselves and have those fulfilling lives and needs that we want out of life. I'll say I went to grad school at the Institute for Humane Education, got a Master of Education from them. My specialty or thesis work in there was in activist education. And I really love what y'all are doing over here at My Sex Bio.
Thank you. So I guess the first question that comes to mind there is, what is the socialist part of that? Because do you go and teach in schools where they already have this, they're having this socialist part of it in mind, or are you bringing that to them, or how does that work? First, what does it mean, and then two, how does it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's some variety there. I'll say that. But I'm a bit of a theory nerd. I'm not by any means a scholar on the subject, but I do love the political economy field and learning from it. So I come to schools and I bring that, and I try to bring that in a very accessible way, depending on the age group that I'm working with. Sometimes I find most people in the United States, I'll start here. So you can tell someone, study economics. You can have them study economics from kindergarten all the way through PhD here in the United States. And they can get a degree they can get a doctorate that says, they've become like an expert in something called economics. And it is entirely possible that they will have never read a single word of Marx or any leftist economist thinker. And that is a result of the capitalist propaganda and infrastructure and cutting out from under us the people and at large, and leftists in particular, the ability to have these conversations. So that is one level of problem. So when I talk about this kind of material, I actually don't generally refer to economics. I refer to something called political economy. Most people in the United States have no idea what political economy is, and that's because of capitalist propaganda and everything I was just talking about. So, but if you were to tell someone, hey, study political economy, there is no way currently that you can study political economy without reading Marx or other leftist thinkers. And so that is one way that I emphasize having to do that. Also, the idea that you can remove economics from political economy is problematic in and of itself. Economics and the economy are inherently tied up with the political system. The example I like to use with that is that You have an employer and you have an employee, and they have a contract together, and it is the state that enforces that contract. So if an employer or the employee violates that contract, then the other party can refer to the state for the enforcement of those consequences. And depending on what political economy you live in, broadly speaking, that would be either capitalism on the one hand or socialism on the other, then the state may be friendlier to one or the other. So that gets at what political economy is the understanding and the study of politics and economics together. And so that's what I bring when I'm talking about the institutional stuff. Again, in an age appropriate way. I don't necessarily go into everything I just talked about with younger crowds, but that gets at the idea. So speaking directly to your question, then, I'm generally invited to speak at schools by either a teacher or a student who has some familiarity with these concepts. Maybe they don't know everything I'm going to be talking about, but they're aware of it. Um, Even if that kind of material is not supported throughout the entire school at every level, which that's something that I would love to see, and I think we need more of, but that's not very common.
Okay. So what does it look like, just out of pure curiosity, what does it look like teaching all this stuff to kids? Like, what are the key concepts that you bring to, a kid, or a teenager when you're trying to approach this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say the youngest I've taught this material in kind of like the structured way that I have now, because I've kind of fumbled around before and like trying to figure out my curriculum and my lesson plan thinking. But the youngest I've taught with this material now is going to be around the junior high level, maybe a little younger. Um, and with those concepts, I really like to pull from what I call the main program that I often bring is called social emotional learning for social justice. So that gets at, like, I can problematize both angles, the interpersonal social emotional learning and the institutional socialist politic, in the way they're taught and talked about. But that gets at how I would problematize the social emotional learning. The big problem with social emotional learning today is that it assumes that everyone involved is on an equal playing field and there's no power differential and everything is a one-on-one relationship. And that's a perfectly fine place to start talking about social emotional learning, but it is a terrible and completely inadequate place to end. And that's where most social emotional learning does end. Whereas we can be having social emotional learning conversations about what it means to live in entire communities. And we can be having social emotional learning conversations about what it means that there are power differentials among different races, different genders, different class groups, etc. So, it's one thing to say your peer who's on an equal footing with you and you are having a conflict, and how do you approach that situation? And it's another thing to say a wealthy white manager, a wealthy white man manager is having a conflict with a working class BIPOC woman employee, and what are the implications of that, and how do we handle that? Those are two completely different questions that need different treatments when there's that power differential.
Okay, so what you're doing when you do this is starting to bring these concepts to kids. So basically, I guess one of the outcomes of teaching this to young people is kind of starting to, you know, dismantle the power structures that are around, that are not benefiting society in general, and especially certain groups of people.
Totally, yeah. I would say, in my teaching work, it's more about bringing that awareness, and then, of course, I would support them in dismantling those oppressive structures. But that's not necessarily the work I'm doing in the classroom, right? I have dabbled with organizing and direct action kind of things, but my primary form of work is teaching, and so in that way, I'm more trying to bring a lens to people so that they can begin to look at with more awareness and critical reflection these power structures and systems, especially the collective systems and how those things operate, as well as the power structures, and having those two things in place, which I find are so so overlooked and undervalued in these conversations.
I agree. Totally agree. Um, all right. So one of the little topics that we want to kind of touch on a little bit today is the intersection between the sex education, between sex education and the education system. So, well, I want to start by exploring what your experience has been with the education system. Maybe starting by asking you what's something that that you wish you had learned at school when it comes to sex education, relationships, and emotions. Because, well, it's important to mention that we know now that sex education is not only about anatomy, right? So, like, part of learning how to have right relationships is also part of sex ed. So, yeah, what's something you wish you had learned at school when it comes to sex ed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say, I myself have definitely had more experience in the education system as a whole than I have had with sex education. My experience with sex education is entirely limited to my own sex education that I received as a student. But and I can talk about those things as well. But yeah, the thing that I really wish I learned in sex education is, broadly speaking, how the patriarchy shows up in our intimate relationships, and what are the implications of that, and what do I do about that. um, and uh, and there are a lot of things that come from that, including, like, in my sex education that I received, which started in 5th grade, and where sex education starts is a whole other thing. But for me, it started in 5th grade, and they divided the presumed to be boys and the presumed to be girls, and they basically gave us an anatomy lesson, which is very valuable. I think that's important to know, and that's so limited and narrow. And also I think, like there we can talk about the merits of dividing the presumed to be boys and the presumed to be girls as one thing, but also, like, the presumed to be boys never got the anatomy class about AFAB bodies, and the presumed to be girls never got the anatomy class about the AMAB bodies. Of course, typically, women are far more aware of the anatomy of men than men are about the anatomy of women. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to recover from just never having that education myself. So that's just that level. But then I think, like, bigger than that is, exploring my own relationship to gender, my own relationship to sexuality, and those things. And then, like, past my own relationship to those things with myself, there's, okay, now I'm in a relationship with someone else, and I'm a white man, and I'm attracted. uh, I would identify as hetero-flexible. So most of the people that I'm going to be with are going to be women or AFAB folk. And okay, now there's a power differential. And what does that mean for my relationships? And how do I honor uh, uh, the conversations that happen while there's a power differential? Um, if I could pick one, like, really important lesson on that front, then I would say the thing that I wish that I learned in sex ed is the uh, the fulfillment that I get, that I can also offer, that the mutual fulfillment that I get in relationship with someone when I actively, not just, like, wait to be told, but actively support their boundaries, the boundaries of my partner. And and ask what those are, and want to learn what they are, and I'm excited to honor them, and uh and the practice that that gives me in being sensitive to when I might be encroaching on someone's boundary. I wish I had that, because I have you know uh I've lived entirely too long without that practice, and I'm as a result not as sensitive to other people's boundaries as I would love to be if I had a lifetime of practice behind me. And and that means I have fucked up, and I hate that, and I have a lot of feelings about that. But that is the most fundamental thing for me on a personal level of what I wish I learned in sex ed. And I think that that's something that's especially important in general for most cis men and boys, and to be exploring and to be taught and practice.
That's important because I think a lot of the I think part of the narrative of we could call it masculinity, but I'm not sure if we can if that would be the right exact word. But it's that of like this whole play of like, if she says no, it's because she's just playing hard to get and she's probably more interested. Like there is a lot of confusion around that we pick up from, like the media, people around us, just the wrong places. So I think that that's very important because it's like one of the many things often overlooked, like, oh, you should just know, but like, wait, what if I don't? um
Absolutely.
and I like that you mentioned that you call them presumed to be girls and presumed to be boys. That's great because that's another whole conversation. Like, you don't know if those presumed to be boys are gonna end up being intimate and in relationships with other presumed to be boys. So like, like the whole purpose of separating, et cetera, it just makes no sense.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to ask you specifically, so in your experience, personal experience, you don't need to talk as, like it's not a professional opinion, but in your personal experience. So what's the answer to those things? Because at the beginning of the answer, you told me I would like to know, I would have liked to be told how patriarchy shows up in our relationships and the implications that has. So how does it show up? How have you learned it shows up? And what are the implications of that?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, getting at that, so the framework that I would offer in going into that is I identify personally capitalism to be the foundational oppressive system. And I want to be clear when I say that I don't mean that capitalism is the worst one or is somehow morally more objectionable than racism or sexism or other forms of oppression. What I mean by foundationally oppressive is that capitalism is the system that materially empowers other oppressive systems. So it is, James Baldwin has a lot of really excellent things that he says, but one of them is that if this is James Baldwin talking, not me, but if a man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If a man can lynch me and suffer no consequences, that's my problem. And in that sense, then we can see how capitalism materially empowers racism because it is the system that decides how to distribute wealth, or whatever political economy we're in is the system that decides how to distribute wealth. And one way to understand wealth is material power. So yeah, so capitalism decides to distribute material power or wealth based on extraction and transactionality. So at the first stage of that, we have what's called primary accumulation, or also called primitive accumulation. I prefer the translation primary accumulation. But land theft is one big example of that. Not the only one, but the theft of the entire continent of Turtle Island, for example, is what allows them to say, okay, now we own the land, not you anymore. It's not held in commons. Now I personally own the land, and if you want to live on it, now you have to pay me. And that creates the demand for this thing that we call money, and now you have to pay me. And so uh, in given that system where the capitalist is backed by the state, and that system then being called capitalism, and that system having materially empowered what we today call white people, at the expense of BIPOC folk, um, then BIPOC folk especially, then we have that's how capitalism. That's one way that capitalism empowers racism, and one way that capitalism empowers the patriarchy or sexism is by giving more material power to men at the expense of women and genderqueer folk. And so, uh, given then that we have this model that says, okay, I'm going to be extracting as much as I can, right, from people, and I want to. Everything is a transaction. Every gift that I give becomes a liability, and everything that I can take from someone becomes an asset. Um, and capitalism actively rewards that, where we praise people who accumulate billions of dollars as though that's somehow noble, where, like, most people, I know I'm getting rambling now, but most people, when they see like an unhoused person, I think our dominant culture has this idea that, like, we have a kind of pity for them. We think, oh, I'm so sorry you didn't make it, right? When I think that, when I look at a billionaire, I think, oh my God, you didn't make it. You didn't realize that accumulating millions of dollars is not worth your time and effort, and that you could have been honoring people and supporting people, and instead you chose to steal their labor at such magnitude that you've accumulated billions of dollars. I feel so sorry for you. I also feel a lot of other things, but one of them. but so yeah, so we then internalize the value of extraction from people, such that then in a relationship, what do we want? We want to get everything we can out of the person, and one of the things that we can get out of people is sex, and uh, that that it, like, spinning off of the James Baldwin quotation. It's one thing to want to get sex from someone, it's another thing to take it from them, and then it's another thing to be able to take it from them without consequence. And we've had uh entirely too many years, too many centuries of people being able to take sex from other people without experiencing any consequences. And that the system that has allowed that is materially empowered by capitalism. So that's one way that capitalism works with the patriarchy and sexism, and works with those interpersonal relationships, where then we internalize the value of extracting from other people, rather than understanding and internalizing the joy of honoring another person's personhood, which is so much more fulfilling.
That's true. Yeah. It's funny because right now I'm having like an aha moment, because it's been like a while since I like kind of got there in my mind of to that thought of like, why is it that we see people in this way? Like we see them kind of almost, and that happens sometimes in both ends of any relationship. We're looking for something, and then we want that something, and then when we meet a new person, or when we are in a relationship with somebody, instead of seeing the person, the way I tend to usually say it is like, we just see a list of needs that pops up in their forehead, needs that they can meet for me. So like, a person could give us, like anything from material things to sex to emotional support to whatever it is that we want. But then instead of seeing the person who's behind that list of needs, we just see the needs. And sometimes, yes, these people could do that for you, but what does it take for them to do that? Like, are you seeing the person? Are you in love with the person, or are you in love with the things that they're giving you? And then what implications does that have for the type of love that you're giving or you think you have for this person? And so, yeah, like that's something that I see a lot around. And it's like a whole debate that I have in my head, because there is a middle point in which, like, okay, there are needs that you have that you cannot negotiate. So like at some point you do have to say, like, maybe I cannot be with you because there are needs that I have that are not, being met. And then it's probably better that, we just take a different path. But at the same time, I don't think that we should think of people in this, like, I think the word is utilitarian way of like, okay, you're here and I used you for something, but I'm not really seeing you as the person you are. And with everything that means, as you said, honoring another person and the joy that brings. So it's just interesting because I had never made that link between this and capitalism in general, and the systems in general that are actually just being reflected in that little aspect of our interpersonal relationships. So that's interesting.
Totally, yeah. Like it's like those cartoons, when some character sees whatever the thing is, whether that's a situation or a person or something, and then you see their eyes turn into dollar signs. It's seeing people as strategies to meet your needs rather than as other people, and it's a kind of objectification. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's very related to that. To the way we just see everything, because we see nature that way. We see, a lot of things that way. So it's just natural in a system like that. Something like that just creeps into our relationships.
Yeah, I just want to throw out there, teaching and also especially parenting is hard. And I remember this conversation. I'm thinking of a tweet that said, parenting is hard. I'm currently having a conversation with my 5-year-old daughter of how vagina is a normal and healthy word and is not something to be ashamed about. And we should still probably come up with a different name for our hamster. And navigating those kinds of things, that's hard. Like how do you have that conversation without like leaving them with some kind of shame around those conversations? That's tough.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn.
I just also want to add another big thing I think that is missing from sex ed and specifically, but just our whole system in general, like the whole fucking world, and including education broadly, is accountability, right? Like there's so much emphasis on bringing consent into sex ed, as there should be, and often that even when we get consent brought into the conversation about consent is make sure you have consent, which is important, and express it that you are offering your consent or not. But often we don't have the conversation, what happens when consent is violated? What does accountability look like? And that the way we've compartmentalized and siloed these things, like maybe that would be in a complementary restorative justice class, and go into more depth, but that does need to be in a sex ed class. I think we have to have those conversations that there are boundaries, and sometimes those boundaries aren't binary. It's not always super clear. Like
that's absolutely true.
Yeah, that like there are some boundaries that are very delineated, and then there are some boundaries that are softer or more flexible, or there's more negotiable boundaries, and people can get into miscommunications, and that happens. And what does accountability look like for those? And what does accountability look like when you have a very clear boundary violation? What if you're the person whose boundaries were violated? I think that should be a conversation in sex ed. And what if you were a person who violated those boundaries? I think that should be a conversation in sex ed. And what if you want a relationship with the other person to continue? And what if you don't want a relationship with the other person to continue? What do those things look like? I think those are all really important conversations to be had.
A lot, especially, it's funny. I guess funny is not the word. It's more like it's kind of an irony how we live in a world where, lifetime commitment is encouraged, and it feels like that should be the norm. So maybe marriage or, things like that. But we don't have these conversations because in 20 years that you're with somebody, a lot of things can happen. 30, 40 years. And then how do you actually effectively navigate those situations? Because as you mentioned, what if you want to stay with this person? Because especially my family, I have seen, a lot of that happening, boundaries crossed. And also then because the person who wants to stay, among the many things that they can feel, they might feel shame, and then how do you navigate that? And how does this person learn or decide for themselves, where do I put the limit? How do I assess if repair can actually happen? Or how do I decide for myself to step up for my own self and be like, you know what, maybe this has to stop here. So I think that's absolutely important. And what you mentioned about it's not black and white, and some boundaries are not as, as clear, or maybe they might change depending on, a lot of different factors. So yeah, I think what you said is so important.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so how might what you teach, which you call socialist emotional learning, complement sex education?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I am teaching more at that relational component, right? The being in relationship with each other, and how do we honor other people's needs, including with the power differential. And I think that those conversations are definitely applicable to sex ed. And I get at those conversations. I generally, most of the time, I visit for one workshop for the day, and that's all the time I get. So I try to present information that offers a framework to kind of begin to understand and think about these things, and b kind of jumping off places if you want to look more into any which thing, right? So in my talk,
I think internet is funky again.
Capitalism, racism, sexism, ableism, all those, as well as resources for better understanding how these systems play out. So that's what I offer in that way. And I think that those conversations show up in our sexual and intimate relationships. And if you think that you are somehow apart from these systems, you're not. But if you think you somehow are apart from these systems, you're also going to be in relationship with people who are involved in these systems somehow. So understanding those systems is also good for us on our own individual levels, and good for being in relationship with other people because they're involved in these systems somehow too. One way that I recognize that I have played out sexism is that even if I were to treat everyone totally equally all the time, and was really great in all aspects of my relationships, which is definitely not true. But even if that were the case, um, it is also true that, you know, saying some hurtful thing to a platonic friend of mine carries with it some amount of hurt. But if I said the same hurtful thing to someone I'm in an intimate relationship with, that is far more hurtful. And because of my sexuality, I've been in more intimate relationships with women and AFAB folk. And that's one way that I have hurt women and AFAB folk more than I have hurt men, just by virtue of being in more intimate relationships with them and playing out all the problematic things that I play out in every other relationship I have. Um, and uh, you know, and that's if everything else is equal, um, which it's not. Again, so uh, by virtue of being able to be more sensitive to these things, and also I just want to name that, like, the word sensitive itself is loaded and charged and is often viewed as like a derogatory term, and I think that's fucked up.
It
But
is.
I think that, yeah, solidarity. But being sensitive to something is a superpower. That's a, like all our fucking superheroes have that power. They are hypersensitive to things, and that's what allows them to be the superheroes they are. So, you know, being hypersensitive to, oh, I'm encroaching on someone's boundary, that's great information to get. Or being hypersensitive to, oh, because I have practiced um, uh, being hypersensitive to, you know, encroaching on someone's boundaries in smaller ways. I see now that I haven't violated someone's bigger boundary right now, but now I see they have that bigger boundary around this thing, and now I know that because I've been practicing, and because I can now sense other people's boundaries better than I would have if I had uh, just done what so many other people do, including myself, for so long, which is think, oh, well, I'm one of the good guys, so I'm never going to violate someone's boundaries. All they need to do is tell me, hey, that's a boundary I have, and I'll stop, as though it were that easy. Um, and you know, there's a flip there on the what things that we need to be including in sex ed, where like I want men and AMAB and boys and AMAB folk to be taught to support other people's boundaries and to listen for those things. And we also need to be supporting women, girls, and AFAB folk and other genderqueer folk we need to be supporting them in their capacity to say no, to assert their boundaries. And uh, and that takes a lot in our system, where uh, saying no or setting a boundary often comes with sometimes really serious consequences, and sometimes brings up trauma, and that's a whole thing. Um, and uh, and one way that we can support people in their capacity to say no is to actively listen for it, even if they're not explicitly saying it, and to understand that sometimes people say no in different ways, which isn't necessarily no, stop that, right? So that gets at that, I think, in some.
All right. And how much attention do you see that schools and institutions pay to this, to educating people on relationships, emotions, and how to navigate these things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so on the one hand, I'm not in a position to see a lot of it myself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I come into school for a day and give a workshop and then leave, I don't see everything else they're doing. On the other hand, I do know at the national level, we're just not doing that. And
Mm-hmm.
many states are just not doing it at all. And I personally don't think any state is doing it enough. Um, so uh, so yeah, we're bad at it. um, and and so much of that comes from the entire system, where, you know, like I myself could be teaching quote unquote mainstream individualist social emotional learning, and I could be seeking out jobs by like cold calling schools and saying, "Hey, I'm a social emotional learning educator. You'll see like all the things that I teach on my website. You come check it out." And it could be all like the mainstream stuff. I'd be getting way more jobs than with what I teach now, which is, I cold call a school and I tell them, "Hey, I am a social emotional learning educator, and I also teach anti-racism, anti-sexism, and about white supremacy and capitalism." And like most places aren't going to take me in on that.
Oops.
Um, exactly. So sex ed is controversial in and of like social emotional learning, generally speaking, isn't controversial. Most of the time, if people aren't interested in it, it's because they don't have the time, right? They're like, "Oh no, I have to meet these other standards or whatever." Whereas sex ed is straight up controversial in a lot of places. So getting it in at all is hard. That phrasing. But then on top of that, like you have a sex ed educator that's going to come in and say, "Hey, not only do I teach like sex ed anatomy, but I also teach about consent and trans inclusion and anti-racism in sex ed, and also like accountability and restorative justice." Like, good luck making a living doing that. Like, are people doing it? Yes, but it's hard. It's really hard, and that's a product of the fucked up capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal, racist domination culture that we're in.
Absolutely. All right. So I think the last question I want to ask you would be about solutions, right? So we've talked a lot about problems. So what changes do you think are needed? And that might be policies, that might be, like people's minds for the education system to acknowledge the importance of sex ed, mental health, relationships, to the point where it becomes mandatory that students receive these in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so at the individual level, which I don't want to end there, I'm going to be clear on that, but at the individual level, that can be hard, and there are ways to figure that out, right? So if you're a teacher, if you're a sex ed teacher, if you're a principal, if you're a superintendent or an administrator, whatever those things are, there's some way to support these conversations more often. And just doing that is something. Um, and if you have some kind of principal power, like that kind of level, you could transform your whole school. Of course, then you have to answer the superintendent and to parent teacher associations and all those things. And if you're a parent, you can enact influence at the parent teacher association if your principal is not doing a good enough job at supporting these things. um, so it's hard because the system is so embedded throughout that almost anything you do is probably going to incur some kind of consequences. And figuring out like, what can I get away with in pushing these conversations? Yeah, so that's hard to figure out, is how much can I be pushing these conversations and still protecting my livelihood. And that includes our mental health, because the stress that organizers and activists go through is immense and is not something that we talk about enough either. Um, so there's that, and you may want to stay very comfortably on the side of protecting your livelihood, and that's fair and legitimate. And I would say never get too comfortable. Always be asking the question, can I bring in anything more? Um, and maybe the answer is no, but it's good to be asking that question to have the awareness if the answer ever does become yes, there's an opportunity here somehow. Um, and so that's at the individual level. But then, there's the collective and organizing level. So if you're a teacher, maybe you know another teacher who's a comrade in this, and you can organize something about this. If you're a student, maybe you can organize with other students and form a student club. Maybe you can find a student advisor or a teacher who is supportive. If you're a principal, be honoring your teachers and supporting them, and bringing in other people who can also do that support. Bring in people who can have those conversations with the parent-teacher associations, or have them yourself. Do that organizing work. That's really important. At the big systemic change level, I mean, yeah, there's a lot there, but the idea that so much sex education is also just abstinence only is absurd, and we need to scrap that. We need to be having sex education that is at one minimum threshold, like based in science. That's so silly that needs to be said, but here we are. It's also, I'll say it's atrocious and violent and traumatic that needs to be said. But yeah, so honoring grounded lived experience of sex education, and having sex education requirements that include consent and include multiple identities, all the different kinds of identities, and having that language in there, into our policies. All that stuff is needs to be in the policies at a federal level, and at a global level, and just everything. But that's going to be a lot of work, but that is the work.
That is the work, and we have to start doing it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Pierce, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot, but it's time to end the conversation to continue it some other place. So, well, I will say that Pierce, collaboration with us, well, he has written an article that is on our website, and you can find it at mysexbio.org/blog. It's called "What Does Sex Have to Do with Socialism?" Very interesting article. Definitely go check it out. And we also have a video series of the lectures that he's put together for fucking capitalism, where you're gonna start exploring a lot what all these concepts mean, just like what we did today, which was, analyzing how the systemic issues intersect with sexuality and with sex ed. He does that with a lot of other different specific topics. He's very passionate about this, so definitely go check out the videos. Also, you can find them on youtube.com/mysexbio. And is there anything that you want to promote? Anything you're working on? Anything you want to let people know?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, and for the plugs and praise. Yeah, you can find me on all the social media things. You can search my name, Pierce Delahunt, or my handle on any of them: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Linktree, Medium. All that is Delapierced. That's DELAPIERCED. So check me out there. This summer has been a whole ride, including a summer camp where I was going to teach that got canceled. But when the school year starts, I'm excited to be teaching again. If anyone needs some lessons, I'm happy to come in physically or remotely. I'm personally in the Bay Area of Northern California, but I do online talks too. And just if you want to reach out and talk about this stuff, I've got resources I can share with you too. You're right. I am passionate about it, and I love having these conversations. So.
Okay, there you have it, everyone. This was Pierce Delahunt on Sex Talks with Diana. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you.
Sex Talks with Diana is produced by MySexBio, an educational platform meant to empower people like you to take command of your sexual story. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify at MySexBio. Visit our website and join our e-letter at mysexbio.org, and support our work by joining our Patreon. If you enjoyed this talk, please share it with a friend to continue the conversation. See you next time!